We'll do a review on Likutei Sichos in Chelek Chof Aleph. This is the third Sicha for the Parshas Boy. The Sicha, the Rebbe explains a Rambam. The Rambam equates and he says that we have to remember uh, Yitzias Mitzrayim just like we have to remember Shabbos. So what's the comparison between remembering Shabbos to remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim? What does it add? And what's the source of the Rambam? The Rebbe is a whole going to explain a whole big arichas, but eventually the Rebbe says that in Shabbos we have two aspects. One is the holding back from doing work, Shabbos vayishavas, that you stopped working. And the other thing of Shabbos is the actual positive of having menucha. That's not just not working, but resting. There's like two steps. And when the Rambam is talking about the Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, besides the fact that on Pesach has to be a story more than just a mention, all year we mention it, but there's also that second aspect of it that when we relate the Yitzias Mitzrayim, not just we went out of Mitzrayim, but to relate all the Nisim and the Nifloes, the great miracles that took place, which is a whole additional dimension. Just like by Shabbos, we have the addition that the Eibishter not only stopped the work, but by Yonach, and the similar, we want to do the source from the Mechilta, as the Rebbe will discuss. We'll do inside, we'll go step by step. Aleph. Wegen der Mitzvah von Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim B'Leil Pesach. With regards to the mitzvah of relating the exodus of Egypt on the night of Pesach. So when the Rambam discusses the mitzvah of relating of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim on Pesach night, night of the Seder, Zok the Rambam, says the Rambam, mitzvah sasei shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflois. It is a positive mitzvah of the Torah to relate the miracles and the wonders that were done, that took place to our fathers in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan. So it's a mitzvah to go through and relate the miracles and the nifloes that happened then, on the night of the 15th of Nisan, Shenemar, as the Pasuk says, Zocher es hayom hazeh asher yitzosem mimitzrayim. Remember this day that you went out of Egypt. Remember the 15th of Nisan. They went out of Nisan. Just like the Pasuk says, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos, that you should remember the day of Shabbos. Say likewise, you have to remember this day that you went out of Mitzrayim. Okay, so the Rambam brings here a comparison to remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim like Yom HaShabbos. So what does the Rambam want with that comparison? And also, where is the source of the Rambam? Stellen sich meforsha Rambam. So the commentaries on the Rambam place themselves and they ask, number one, Aleph, was meint der Rambam mit Kimoshe Nemar Zocher es Yom HaShabbos? What does he mean? What is added? What does it mean? He says, just like it says, remember the day of Shabbos. Was is nit maspik in dem tzivui? What isn't sufficient in the command, Zocher es hayom hazeh, remember this day, when we talk about Yitzias Mitzrayim, was dos lernt men arois, that you need, what is added, that you learn out from them fargleich, mit Zocher es Yom HaShabbos, to comparing it with the day of Shabbos. So that's number one. What is it actually that we're learning out that we don't know from the pasuk of Zocher, to remember as Hayom Hazeh of Yitzias Mitzrayim, that we learn out from Shabbos? And number two, base by Shabbos, if we must come on to the comparison to remembering by Shabbos, who is the mokar of them? So where is the source for this comparison? So the Rebbe wants to know what is added, and the Mepharshim ask what is added with Zocher Shnemar Zocher Shem Shabbos, and what's the source? And the Rebbe we're going to bring down the noise base for Sefer HaMitzvahs. It seems that the Sefer HaMitzvahs is has a similar idea. And over there, it seems like that the Chiddush is that, like this, you might think that Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's only in a way of Sipur. You have children, as we'll see, you have to relate to someone, but on its own, there may not be a mitzvah. So we're learning out from Shabbos, just like Shabbos is a mitzvah regardless. So also, the mitzvah is also by Yitzis Mitzrayim. But the Rebbe is not going to accept that for various reasons. Base is that this is what the Rambam means here. In Sefer HaMitzvahs, bring the Rambam. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam brings down the Losher HaMechilta. He brings down the Mechilta, the language of the Mechilta. From the fact that Torah says, when your son asks you, what is this avodah that you were doing on this night, and you will tell him. So basically, it seems like Yochel, you might conclude from that pasuk, Im yisholcha bincho atamagid lo. If your son asks you, then you'll tell him. But what if he doesn't ask you? Then you don't tell him. It's only a mitzvah to respond to a question of the child. Talmud Loimer, so that's what the pasuk says. No, that even if he doesn't ask you, you should tell you. There's another pasuk that says that you should tell your son, even though he doesn't ask you. Okay, so still there seems to be a limitation in not asking, but there has to be a son to tell. But what happens? There's no son. You don't have any sons to tell to. What happens? Other people. This is the Lashon and Mechilta. So we know only in a time you have a son. It's a mitzvah to tell him. Even when he doesn't ask you, tell him. But if there's no son by yourself, how do we know there's a mitzvah to relate to Yitzias Mitzrayim? Or you're with others, but there's no son there. How do we know? Talmud Loimar. So he quotes this pasuk, that same pasuk that the Rambam we started in the Yad HaChazaka, and the pasuk says, there's no restriction, there's no limitation over here of children or telling it or asking it, just regardless. There's a mitzvah just to remember. And the Rambam is Moisif, and here too, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam adds, Reitze loymar shu tziva lezochrei k'may shenemar zochres Yom HaShabbos. Hashem commanded to remember Pesach. Just like he said, remember Yom HaShabbos. There's haste, which means, as from Posik, zochres Yom HaZah asher yitzosim Mitzrayim. That from the pasuk, remember this day that you went out of Mitzrayim, led men up. So from there we learn as mitzvah zechiras yitzias Mitzrayim, that the mitzvah of remembering the exodus of Egypt is the oich also. It also exists. We also have to do it ben atzmei, just between yourself, even there's no child there. Even if there is no son that is asking the question, there's still a mitzvah of Zocher. And the Rav is the Rambam Moisif al Seichoche, and the Rambam adds as proof that you're still obligated to tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, even there's no son to tell it to. Al Seichoche as a proof to this. Right, so Leimar, what it means to say, just like he says, Shabbos, there is no limitation that you need anybody else by yourself. Ask Hashem v'derchiu zchiras Yom HaShabbos yizech b'nei leben atzmei. Just as the obligation to remember the day of Shabbos also is on your own, between yourself, there's nobody there. Azoy oich zochras Yom hazeh. The same thing is zochras Yom hazeh of Yitzias Mitzrayim, that we have to tell the story, whether regardless if there's a son or not. So that's the way the Rambam writes the Sefer HaMitzvah. So it would be almost logical that this is the same idea over here in the Sefer Hayad. What he wants to add with the word Zohar Shem HaShabbos, K'moshe Nemar, Zohar Shem HaShabbos is to equate that there's a chiv even if there's no children. If he says L'choira Mashma. According to this, it would seem, it appears, Ados is Erch Kavanosi in Sefer Hayad. This is actually also his intent in the Sefer Hayad. In dem was vergleicht the mitzvah for Zohar Shem Hazeh to Zohar Shem HaShabbos. The fact that he equates the mitzvah to remember this day, the Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, to Zohar Shem HaShabbos. That as it is mechuyev oich b'nei lebenatzme, that he is also obligated in Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, even by himself, without children, without telling it to anybody. This is the Chelek mashma von hemshech haloshen. It also appears so in the continuation of the language. Umenayin shebelel chamisha osor. He says, how do we know that in the night of the 15th? The Torah says to remember this day. Maybe remember it some other time. How do we know that the memory takes place on that same day in which it happened, at the night when it happened? How do we know it's at the night of the Chamish, the night of the Seder? Umenayim sheblel Chamish osor. Talmud loymar, because the Pasuk says, "V'gavto levincho bayemahu leimer." You'll tell your son. It says, "Bavur zeh." So because of this, the avodah that you're doing on the night of the 15th, the Seder, you have matzis, they're lying before you. So that's when you do the zechira. That's what you're telling your son. So the Rambam says, Ve'af al pi she'en lo ben. He adds, even if he doesn't have a son. Afilu chachamim, even if you're wise, you still are obligated. Now, the Rambam adds the word Afa Pishain Ben. Seems like he's trying to tell you that this is from the Pasuk of Kimay. This is what he added by saying Kimay, Zochar Shem HaShabbos. Was the Pashtus meant this, that simply this means as the Mokere from Din, the Afa Pishain Ben. What is the source for the halacha that even if you're not a son, is from the Friegebrachten Pasuk. That's the Pasuk brought down earlier. Zochra Shem Hazeh was Vetni Dermont Ben Kadema. It brings the Pasuk before Zochra Shem Hazeh. Over there is no mention of Ben. So therefore, his Afa Pishen Le Ben is Zocher as Hayem Hazeh, and that's the source. So that's why the Rambam adds the Pasuk, the comparison to Shabbos. And the source will be the Mechilta to say that you don't need a son in order to do the mitzvah of Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's independently, Beinoi lebein atzmai, you're obligated. But the Rebbe finds it difficult to say that this is the whole reason. Because the Rambam over here in the Yad HaChazokeh, he never brought down the pasuk that there is a ben, and therefore he has to say, no, it's not only a ben. Mele in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the way he starts off, we got to levincha, and then you think maybe it's only when you have a ben, so the Rambam, the Sefer HaMitzvahs has to say no. But over here, Mechatesa, what do you know? Why would you think only a ben? It says Zochar Esayim. It doesn't say Ayim Hazeh. It doesn't say there's no ben over there, as the Rebbe said. And therefore, why would the Rambam have to shoylel it and say no? Gimel. Rambam, Dr. Rebbe, this is difficult to say. Das ist der ganze Tam, was der Rambam is Moshe. This is the entire reason. This is the full reason that the Rambam adds K'moshe Nemar Zochar Shem HaShabbos. To say that you have to say Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim even without a ben. Warum von dem Loschen von dem Pasuk Gufa? Because the language of this pasuk itself, it says, Zochar es hayom hazeh sheyitzosem mitzrayim. Remember this day you went out of Egypt, there's no ben, there's no mention there, canal. As Ibaldas Vertni der Mond Ben, and I said before, since no Ben is mentioned, Unafila Nitachedim, there's no mention of others, there's nothing, there's not just, it's verstandig, it's understood. Ader Chiyuv HaZechire is Euch Ben Elu Ben Atzme, that the obligation to remember is also amongst yourself. Uve Mizetos in Mechilta Gufa, and as you see in the Mechilta doesn't bring evidence. As das dort bringt sich nicht der Pasuk Zochar es Yom HaShabbos. He doesn't bring like Zochar es Yom HaShabbos because the Pasuk itself that the Mechilta explains that you have to not only V'Gadet Lebincha, not only when the Achedim, and not only with Sheikh Sholcha Bincha, not only V'Gadet Lebincha, but just on your own, he just brings the Pasuk because it says Zochar es Yom Hazeh, meaning there's no stipulation, there's no condition, you have to have a son. That alone is sufficient for the Mechilta to make the point that the Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim doesn't require a Ben and or anybody else. So how come the Rambam has to add? Does bringt sich nicht der Pasuk Zochar es Yom HaShabbos. You don't bring the Pasuk Yom HaShabbos to prove this point. But the Rebbe says it's different in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, in which the Rambam starts with the Pasuk V'Gadato, that there is a Lebincha, so he says, okay, there's the Pasuk Zochar es Hayom to tell you, like Lekache. But in the Rambam here, why would you even think it just brings down this Pasuk? B'Shloimo in Sefer HaMitzvahs. We understand the Sefer HaMitzvahs, kemen noch verstehen, we can understand was the Rambam kommt on to Schira Shabbos, why he comes on to remembering Shabbos, like we say, remember Shabbos. Yois, as the limud as Schira di Yitzis Mitzrayim from Zocher v'Gomer. This lesson that we learn to remember Yitzis Mitzrayim Poskim Zocher comes as an addition to what the Rambam has already brought down, the other psukim. But what is the opening and the main learning, from what do we learn is dort und in der Mechilta was bringt, and in the Mechilta that the Rambam brings in Sefer HaMitzvahs von ki sholcha binchon v'Gadet Levincha, from the starting off when your son asks you and when you relate to your son, these two psukim. Dafür der Rebbe Bavorenen. Therefore, it needs to caution, as that posik Zocher es Hayom Hazeh, that this posik Zocher es Hayom Hazeh meint as Zechira was is nicht verbunden mit ki sholcha bincha v'Gadet Levincha. That is not associated, not tied to your son asking you, or you're relating to your son, has nothing to do with a son. Not wie bei Schiras Shabbos, but just like mentioning Shabbos, as oich bein noile bein atzmai, is do der chiyuv mitzvah zechiras yitzis Mitzrayim, that even on your own, by yourself, you're still obligated to Yitzis Mitzrayim, because we're bringing in this in as an addition to the psukim where it does talk about a ben, it does talk about sholcha bincha, it does talk about the V'Gadet Lebincha. So we're saying over here, no, this pasuk is Zocher is coming to tell you, even if you don't have a ben, that's okay in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. Oh, but in Sefer HaYad, Vuder Limud from pasuk Zocher es Hayom Hazeh, that lesson that is from the pasuk Zocher es Hayom Hazeh is that Einzige Moker Lachiv from Sipur B'Yitzis Mitzrayim. He brings that as the only source for the obligation to relate the Exodus of Egypt. To learn, so where would you come on to say, to learn, as the Pasuk meant Ben Davke? Why would you say we didn't mention anything about a son? Why would this Pasuk be talking about a son, Davke? Because you would think that means a son, so he needs to bring evidence for Schiras Shabbos, from the mentioning of Shabbos, this means also by himself. So if the Rambam, to say that the Rambam is bringing down Zocharis Yom Shabbos to tell you that it's not only if there's a sun over there, there is no need, doesn't seem in our case, to make any proofs because there is no point in where it says a son, so that you should say that the Zohar includes everybody. Unlike in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, where over there it fits in with the Rambam's whole presentation. He says, first we got to Levincha, and the Shalcha Bincha, and he got to Levincha. Then he brings you the pasuk, which means, oh, this doesn't mean son dafke, but this is just like by Shabbos. But in Sefer Hayad, where he only brings the pasuk Zohar, there's no mention of Ben. Why would he have to say Nemer Zohar Shem Shabbos? So we have this question. So maybe the Rebbe will explain that how do we know? Torah says we have to remember that day. But how do we know that remembering that day is on the day? Remembering that day, you could be on a different day. Where do we learn the day? Maybe when the Rambam is adding, he brings from the Migdal Ois, that he learns that in the Pshat is when it says Zochar Hashem Ashkemosh Amre Zochar Hashem Shabbos. The way the Migdal Ois learns the Pshat in Sefer HaMitzvahs, that when it says there like Yom HaShabbos, to tell you that the mitzvah to remember this day is on the day. By Shabbos, we remember Shabbos not on Sunday, but on the day itself. That's when we remember it. Dalet. And he wants to learn, perhaps maybe that's what the Rambam means over here too, to remember Shabbos, just like remember Shabbos on the day. That's the mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim on the day of on the night of the 50th. Dalet. The Migdal Ois bringt Loshen HaMechilta Hanal. The Migdal Ois quotes, brings down the language of the Mechilta of above. Und is der noch Messiah, and then he concludes, because of Ramzal b'Sefer HaMitzvah Shaloi, so that the Rabbeinu Moshe, the Rambam, writes in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, Shehu tzivo b'zechirosei b'zmanei, that he has commanded us to remember in its time. Zocher es hayoim hazeh, in the time of that day, the day that you're remembering, then is when you should mention it. On the day that you're remembering, that's when you remember Bismanoi at that time. Zocher es hayoim hazeh, Ritzono loimar, Eshehu tzivo l'zochrei. Zocher es hayoim hazeh means remember the day that he commanded to remember it. What does it mean? That's what the quote from the Migdal Ois explaining the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. So based on this explanation, we can say Ados is the Pshat in the Halacha now b'Sefer Hayad, in the above Halacha in the Sefer Hayad. The Rambam learned a reis from Posik, Zocher as hayoim hazeh asher yitzosem miMitzrayim. Remember this day that you left Egypt. Asizdo a mitzvahs eser miyuchedes lesaper b'yitzias Mitzrayim. There's a special positive mitzvah to tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim in them talk on that day, on the day of Yitzias Mitzrayim. When das ist vorgekommen, when it took place, on that day is the mitzvah. In addition to the obligation to remember Exodus of Egypt all year, which we learn from the pasuk that says you should remember the days you left Egypt, all the days of your life. So there's an obligation to remember exit of Egypt every day of your life, all the time. But in addition, there is a mitzvah on the night of Pesach. Und if dem bringt die Chochem. And for that, the Rambam brings the proof. How do we know that the mitzvah is on that day itself? Just like it says, remember the Shabbos day. You remember the Shabbos day by all the inyanim we do on Shabbos, and don't do lacha and do. But dort is the Zchira b'yem zeva atzmai. That is remembering that day itself. The same thing here. Zocharis Yom Hazeh means on that day, on the night of the 15th. One of them is the Rambam Mamshich. And then the Rambam continues, how do we know that it's on the night of the 15th? What is the Rambam saying further? Because then it would flow. Because just on this day could be any part of the day, maybe as soon as the day enters. He wants to say that it's on the Leil, on the night of the Seder. Because based on that lesson which we learned from the pasuk, just remember this day means on that day Hanal that we said before. What man can sagen, at the mitzvah is take a b'knisas hachag. Then you could say that the mitzvah is as soon as the Yom Tov enters. There's an obligation of remember it's on that day. There's already a chiyuv. Oder, or even Gor Mibeid Yom, or even Yochel Mibeid Yom, I said even from the daytime. The Rebbe quotes in the Ha'ara 22 that would be like Kiddush from the daytime to be Mekadesh the day that's coming up. But where do we know that this is specifically at the nighttime? So therefore, the Rambam, the Rebbe is Mamshich. That's why he continues and bring them posik v'igad to levincha b'yom hu leimer b'avur zeh b'shoshe yesh matzu mor menoch l'fanecha. He brings the posik v'igad levincha b'yom b'avur zeh. He's pointing to the matzah and the morer b'shoshe yesh matzu mor menoch l'fanecha. When you have matzah morer placed before you, when does a person have matzah morer? That's at the night of the Seder. So since that Torah is telling him, tell him Bavur Zeh, that means that's when he's relating, that's when the story is taking place. So this tells us that within the day, it has to be at the time, Belel, as the Chiv HaGot is Belel Chamisha Osor, the night of the 15th. That would be the flow. So the Rambam says Shabbos on that day, and when on that day, on the night of the 15th, the night of the Seder, when you have the matzah and the morer. But the Rebbe asks that still that doesn't answer the question why the Rambam adds it. This isn't sufficient. So the Rebbe has two things, because number one, we learn it by Shabbos. We learn Zohar Lekadshoy. That's how we know. And Rambam doesn't bring down the word Lekadshoy. So the Rambam then should have brought down here in the beginning when the mitzvah is from the Pasuk V'Yigadata. Let's learn Kisai. Das is aber nicht masbih, it's not sufficient. According to this, that we're trying to point out that it's on the day you mentioned, Zechira is on the day when that happened, the Rambam should have quoted not just Zochar Hashem Shabbos, he should have said Lekadshoy, because the word Lekadshoy, in addition to this point, the Rebbe is going to make another point. The first point the Rebbe is making in the bracket, Vorum Lifizeh, is Noisef of them. In addition, we have first problem number one. As the Hechelek by Shabbos Guf, how do we know by Shabbos has the Zechira Darv Zayin B'Yom Shabbos Hatzmei? How do we know it needs to be on the day? Maybe you remember Shabbos on another day. is l'chayda from vort lekatshay. Remember this day and make it holy. So that day that you're mentioning, that's when you're making it holy. V'shteit noch zocheres yom HaShabbos. That says, remember the name of Shabbos, lekadishoy, to make him holy. So that means that the remembering is at the time that you're making it holy. Is oib nor dos vol do geven kavonas Rambam. If only this, the Rebbe is not rejecting out it can also be included. But if this was the only thing that was the intention of the Rambam, to say that that is the day that's on the day itself, then he should have quoted them Vort Lekache, which is the proof by Shabbos that it means on that day. You mentioned Shabbos on the day when you're Mekadesh, isn't it more? So it's still not understood. Why does the Rambam, since at the end the Rambam anyways has to come onto the Pasuk V'Yigada Tolibincha to tell you that it means the nighttime, because from Zohar we could be in the beginning of the day or even an Erev Yontiv. So why doesn't he just bring down the Pasuk V'Yigada Tolibincha so we know when it is? If in order to learn the special it's not enough to Pasuk Zohar Hashem Shabbos Lekatshe. Oh, the Rambam Bechlal Nigida bringing them limbo. The Rambam did not have to at all bring down the lesson. What we learn, Shenemar Zocharas Hayem Hazeh Asher Yitzosim Mitzrayim. Remember the day that you went out of Mitzrayim. Und der Far darf Moshe sein der Chocha, ki Moshe Nemar Zocharas Yom HaShabbos. And then have to add the proof like Zocharas Yom HaShabbos. He wants to say that it's on the Shabbos day, and then so you Zochras Yom, and that means from Shabbos we learned that it means the day itself. He should have brought down the pasuk from Vanat Meleret Tarois Dem Chiyuv in the Mizman from Leil Chamish also Benissen. Bring the pasuk down from which we learned the obligation of the time of Leil Chamos from the night of the 15th is what brings the doch lach lacher is it. He brings it immediately afterwards. Tell your son on that day, Bavurzeh, so it means on that day, on the night of the 15th, is when you're telling your son about the Tzipur Yitzis Mitzrayim. That's the source. So why bring the Pasuk Zochar where it's not clear what its day it is? And you're saying that this is similar to Shabbos. Anyways, that's not the source for this exact mitzvah. The mitzvah miyichedus is not just on the day. The mitzvah miyichedus is at the night of the Seder. So why don't you bring the pasuk v'gad to lebincha? So something else is going on over here. The Rebbe brings down from Shmos Rabbah that there's actually a conceptual comparison to the way we remember Shabbos, that we have to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim. Remembering Shabbos is in a more miraculous way, the whole creation, similarly by Shabbos. Hey, Benira Loimar. The Rebbe seems to say, as the Moker Divrei HaRambam, that the source for the words of the Rambam is from Shmos Rabbah beParsha Seinu, the Shmos Rabbah in our Parsha. The andere Meforshim sagen, other Meforshim say this. Was dort gleicht man zu die Zechira die Yitzias Mitzrayim zu der Zechira de Shabbos. Over there, in the Shmos Rabbah, he equates the remembering of Yitzias Mitzrayim to the mitzvahs, the remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim to the mentioning, the remembering of Shabbos. This is the Lashon in the Shmos Rabbah. Hazer li Yisrael, warn thee, Kishem shebaros Yisraelim v'amarti lehem li Yisrael, liskeres yom Shabbos, just as I created the world, and I told the Yidden to remember the day of Shabbos, of creation. Zocher Zeicher Lamase Bereshis, to remember the act of creation. Shenemer Zocher Hashem HaShabbos, remember Shabbos, the creation. Kach Hayu Zeichrim Hanisim Shasisi Lochem b'Mitzrayim. Likewise, you should mention, you should remember the miracles I did to you when I took you, that I did to you in Mitzrayim. V'zichru l'yoyim sheyitzosem misham, and remember the day that you went out from there. Shenemar zocher es hayem hazeh sheyitzosem Mitzrayim. Remember this day that you exited Egypt. So there is an equation over here, just like we're supposed to remember Bereshis, Shabbos Bereshis, for remembering of creation. We have to remember the miracles. But again, what's the halacha over here? That's the Rebbe is going to discuss. The Rambam is not just telling us that we have to remember just like this, to remember creation, we have to remember miracles. What specific halachas does the Rambam have in mind? But Afaber Farstein, we need to, however, understand the Sefer Hayad is the Sefer. They say the Yad HaChazokim was sein Inyan is halachas, that's laws. When it's tam mighty sein droshes Razal, it's not just to quote the expounding of our sages of blessed memory. What is the halacha in Sipur? What is the halacha in the Relepetzias Mitzrayim? We learned up from the Hashva Hanal that we can learn from the comparison, comparing the remembering of Yitzias Mitzrayim to the remembering of Shabbos. So, Bechlal, there is a difference that on Pesach, we have to relate. It's not just to mention. It's more. The Pasuk says Zocher, but we know over there it has to be part of a story at length. But besides that, a whole year, the mitzvah is just that we left Mitzrayim. But on Pesach, it's the miracles that took place then, the Nisim and Niflos, not just we left Mitzrayim, just like we are on Shabbos creation, the miracle of creation, or the Ma'aseh Bereshis, same thing. That's the addition. The bir was that. In that halacha wegen Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, the halacha when he says to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim is kavanose shel Rambam zu mefarish sein. The Rambam's intent is to explain the shinui betoichen achiyuv, the difference in the content of the obligation from their mitzvah Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim b'del leil tezvav Nisan, in the mitzvah remembering the exodus of Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Legabe mitzvosa agansyor, compare it to the mitzvah all year. The hisofe in their mitzvah belel chamish osor b'Nisan, the addition of the mitzvah on the night of the 15th of Nisan, what is in addition to the regular mentioning it all year, is nit nor in them. It's not only in the fact was b'chol hashana is the mitzvah lahaskir. All year the mitzvah is just to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim, mentioning. Says genug aschira ba'alma, it's sufficient just to remembering. Betezvav Nisan is the mitzvah lesaper, and on the 15th of Nisan is the mitzvah to relate. So that's one thing, but there's more than that. Barichus, at length, chulu. Besides that, there's additional. Nor is achilik in them toichen of mahus ha-mitzvah haschira. But there's a difference in the content, in the essence of the mitzvah of mentioning, how we're mentioning, what we're mentioning. There's a difference in the mentioning, in the zechira, in the remembering. B'chol yemois hashana is maspik lahaskir yitzias Mitzrayim. All year round, it's sufficient to remember Exodus of Egypt, without miracles, without anything around it. The Eibishter took us out of Mitzrayim. The Zechira as Eden Zayin Reis for Shibud Mitzrayim, the remembrance that the Jews went out from the slavery of Egypt. Aber Beleil Pesach, but when it comes to the night of Pesach, is the mitzvah nit nor the Yitzim in Mitzrayim. The mitzvah is not just the Exodus of Egypt. Nor Lesaper ben Nisim v'niflos is the miracle to relate the miracles and the wonders. The nisim v'niflois was that Eibishter had getan. The miracles and the wonders that Hashem has done arois them in the kingdom from Mitzrayim, when He took us out of Mitzrayim. Not just that we left Mitzrayim, but the miracles that took place. Und das lernt man auch von der Hashva zu Zocheres Yom HaShabbos. This we learn from the comparison to remembering the day of Shabbos. In Posik Zocheres Hayom Hazeh Sheyitzosem Mitzrayim. In the Posik, remember this day you went out of Egypt, is nit mefurish mudgosh. It's not articulated. It's not emphasized. In there is a chira belil Pesach, that when we remember on the night of Pesach, darf sein der lesaper v'nisim v'niflos. It needs to be relating the miracles and the wonders. Doesn't say so clearly in the pasuk. Bavor and the Rambam. That's why the Rambam cautions us and explains as der zocher do is k'moshe nemar zocher esiyem Shabbos. That when it says here zocher, it's like zocher esiyem Shabbos. V'schires Shabbos is zecher lemaise bereishis. It's the act of creation. O k'moshe nemar behemshech zu zocher esiyem Shabbos. Act of creation, which is the Shem's creating a world, a whole. As the pasuk says, that the Eibishter created for 6 days, and that's why it's remembering the Shabbos to remember what Hashem did. As the language of the Medrash, kishem, that there is a mitzvah to say the Maaseh Bereishis, Lizkeres Yom HaShabbos Zeichel Maaseh Bereishis, to remember the Yom HaShabbos as a remembrance to the act of creation. Kacha Yezeichim Hanisim Chul, remember the miracles. So the Rebbe's source for the Rambam is from the Medrash, and what the Medrash teaches us is that we have to appreciate more than just leaving Mitzrayim, but there's the miracles and the act what took place, just as Shabbos celebrates the creation, the Hashem's act of creation. This celebrates Hashem's miracles and iflos. And the Rebbe goes further that really in Shabbos, as the Ram, there is the idea of resting in addition to not doing melacha, and the Rambam wants to bring this down by comparing it to Shabbos, that the main part of Yetzias Mitzrayim is not only that we're out of slavery, but we're a free people. We're Cherusenu. Let's look by the Vav. Deeper, we can say, as the Hashvot to Zocher Yom HaShabbos, by comparing it to Yom HaShabbos, is nit nor a mocker of dem chiyuv l'saper benisim beniflois kulu. Not only this is used as a source for the obligation that we have to also relate the miracles and the wonders, not just the exodus of Egypt on the night of the Seder, Leil Chamishos, nor oich a hagdoma to divide the halachas in the period, but this serves as an introduction to the further laws in the period. Ubahagdim divrei harambam in Oneib Hilchos Shabbos. The Rebbe brings down first the words of the Rambam in the beginning of Shabbos to see how Shabbos has this unique, not only not working, but a yin of resting. The Rambam says that in the beginning of Shabbos, Shvisa b'shvi me'melacha mitzvah sasei. To resting on the 7th day from work is a positive mitzvah. Shnamar ubayom hashvi tishbos. You must rest on the 7th day. V'chol ha'isa b'melacha. Anybody who does melacha on Shabbos, bittul mitzvah sasei v'avar alei sasechulu. He wasted a positive mitzvah and he violated alei saseh. Das heißt, as by Shabbos seinen do zwei inyonim, that by Shabbos there are 2 ideas. Sai an inyan de shlila. He says you have to rest, but if you do malacha, you're not resting, you're mevatlan esse, but you're also buying a leisase, which means that Shabbos there's two inyanim. Sayan inyan de shlila. There is also something that you don't do. Leisase, don't do. Isur malacha, don't do malacha. Sayan inyan de chiyuv, and there's also there's a positive idea on Shabbos. I say, Shevasan, you have to rest. Why does the Rambam start with the mitzvah of Shvisas Shabbos versus not doing Malacha on Shabbos? Because that's the main theme of Shabbos. From them was the Rambam, hebt on Hilchas Shabbos mit der mitzvah sasei. The fact that the Rambam begins the laws of Shabbos with this positive mitzvah. Afal pi, notwithstanding, although most of the Shabbos is the prohibitions. As Rubam Kulam von Hilchas Shabbos, the majority, as all of the laws of Shabbos, are in the aspect of Shabbos's prohibitions. In the Pratam Malachas, the different work, the Lamites Ovis Malachas Vitul the Semchulu, the 39 main categories and the derivatives, it's all about the Rambam, about the prohibitions. But yet the Rambam starts with the mitzvah of resting, is moving. So we understand. As the Iker von Shmiras Shabbos, that the main of keeping Shabbos, is not der inyan ha-heder v'hashlila for malacha. It's not just the negation of doing work, of that it's missing, we're not doing the lack and negation of work, nor that inyan chiyuvi, but main Shabbos is the positive. Hase menucha, make a rest day. Quoting the Ragachover, and not doing work. It's not just bittel, taking away work, but the resting. Was in them is done halacha. There's also a different halacha. The Ragachover is in the Mavayed, as the Ragachover explains. So this is by Shabbos. And in Shabbos, and then we're going to, in Shabbos, where do we get these two parts of Shabbos, not doing Malacha in Shabbos, is that I was going to call two psukim. In one pasuk, we emphasize the idea of Shabbos, and then we have the pasuk of not doing the Malacha. And this is also what the Rambam is trying to bring out to Yitzias Mitzrayim, what the Zohar Yitzias Mitzrayim is, Yeshloiman, Zion. As these two aspects, the inyan shlili, the negative, not doing, the inyan chiyuvi and the positive b'Shabbos, kommen von the zwei parshas und psukim verstehen by Shabbos. They come from the two portions and verses that are written by Shabbos. Number one, Allah b'maise bereshis, when the act of creation says vayishbos vayem hashvi mekol malachto, he rested from work, asher also that he did. And then it says, "Vayivorech Elikim es Yom Hashvi v'Hakadosh Yisei." Hashem blessed it 7th day and He made it holy. Kivei Shavas Mekol Malachta. So it's all about. On that day He rested from work. Shabbos is about resting from work in these psukim. Thus was there in them tog is given the Shvisa v'Heder HaMalacha. This day it's resting and not lack of work. That's the one pasuk. Beis by Matan Torah, later on by Matan Torah, there is the Hemshech to Zochar Hashem HaShabbos. The pasuk says Zochar Hashem HaShabbos. Pasuk says Kisheishes Yomim Osa Hashem Es HaShamayim Ves HaOretz Es HaYom Es Kol HaShabam. Hashem created. For 6 days, He made the heavens and the earth and the ocean, everything that's in it. Then it says, "Vayonach bayem hashvi." He rested on the 7th day. It doesn't say mikol malachta. It doesn't say the malach. It just says rested on the 7th day. Al kein beirach Hashem es yom Shabbos vaykadshehu. That's why God blessed this day of Shabbos and made it holy. The Eizgeteltkeit from Shabbos. So what distinguishes, distinguishes Shabbos, is nicht nur der mit. It's not just the fact was damals hat sich geendigt the meiste Bereshis that there the act of creation finished. V'shavas mekom malachte. The sheishis yomim osa Hashem. V'yishbes mekom malachte. That for 6 days Hashem made, and now He rests mekom malachte. No noch mehr. This is more than that. V'yomach v'yom hashvi. He rested on the Yom HaShvi. Not just that He ceased working, but He's rested. Those was their tog is anders von andere Tag. The fact that it's different than other days, it's not just because we don't work there. The mitvaser is mushlo from locha. It's not just because it's negated. Behesem lazeh, I skipped. This is what the pasuk says. Zocharesh Yom Shabbos. The schira for Shabbos, remembering Gedra Vinyonim is the Ian Chiyuvi for Shabbos. The definition, what does it mean? That is the positive of Shabbos. Nit nor der Monen, not only to mention those was der Tog is anders von ander Tag. Not just to mention that it's different than other days because there's no work, but because you're resting. That mitzvah said is mushlo for malacha. That is negated that you don't do work. It's a day that is not a day of work. But also the fact that it has in itself a positive aspect. Hashem rests on the 7th day. As our sages tell us, as that all creation, Hashem created everything, but the world was lacking. They were missing menucha, rest, bos Shabbos, bos menucha. Shabbos comes menucha, okay. Menucha is not just not working, but the idea of chaser, and now you have menucha. This is expresses itself that you remember Shabbos, Zochares Yom HaShabbos to Vayonach B'Yom HaShvi. B'Shein Rambam, Zochareu Zechiras Shvach V'Kiddush. Remember Him as praise and sanctification and Kiddush. The Rebbe brings out that in Shabbos we have this extra idea, one not working, but the extra idea is also resting on Shabbos. And that's what we learn out from the Pasuk in Aseres Hadibros, where it says, Zochares Yom HaShabbos, that the main is, or the idea of menucha, that there is a idea of resting. And now the Rebbe wants to say that this is what the Rambam compares Yitzias Yitzias Mitzrayim to Shabbos. And thus is Ech Kavonas HaRambam. We can say this is also the Rambam's intent. Mit der Hashvoah von Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim to Zechiras Shabbos by equating the exodus of Egypt to remembering Shabbos. As Euch in dem Tzipur B'Yitzias Mitzrayim, that also in the story of the exodus of Egypt is that Iker der Inyan Chiyuvi Shaboy. Of the main thing is the positive of Yitzias Mitzrayim. There's the idea of the Chiyuvi, not just the exodus of Egypt, but becoming a free people, as Rebbe will explain. The explanation of this is by Yitzias Mitzrayim by the Bnei Yisrael of Giton Tzvei Zachen. By the exodus of Egypt, this accomplished by the Yidden, made up by the Yidden, two aspects, two things. Aleph, Bittel v'Yitziyah for Shibud U'Neshus Mitzrayim, the negation and the exodus from slavery and the dominance of the Egyptians. They took away, they negated, they exited, they went out of the dominance of the Egyptians. Base, number two, that they became free people, they became in their own rishus. And this is really a two-step process, which is generally by avodim, one to leave the master, then to become a free person. The Rebbe brings by Yovel is actually to Rosh Hashanah, they were no longer slaves, but the free people that became in Yom Kippur. So it's even two Zmanim. So these are two separate aspects. Ubedugma v'dosis by the Yitzia v'shichrut from Yed as it is by the Exodus and the freedom from any slave. Aleph, number one is their bitla shibut von Odin, to negating and taking away the slavery of the master. Evert nifkam b'rshusha balusay. He exits his domain and his ownership. You leave the master. Based those is the second aspect, that he acquires himself now as a free person. And these are totally two separate matters. They're not this one and the same. These are two separate aspects we may find by the Yetzia von Eved B'Yovel, as we find by the exodus of a slave during Yovel. As the zwei Yonim werden aufgetan in zwei besondere Zmanim. These two aspects are accomplished in two separate times. Ubelshona Rambam, as the Rambam writes, Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim, that from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, Loi hoyu avodim niftarim lebateim. They haven't left their homes. They didn't go home after Rosh Hashanah till Yom Kippur. But also they were not enslaved to their masters. Kivon shegiya Yom Kippurim, but once Yom Kippurim reaches, Toko Bezdin b'shofar, then Bezdin blows the shofar. Niftaru avodim le'abatayim. That's when they go home. So that's the second prong, the second step, going home, becoming a free people. So you see very clearly this is divided into two parts. Und das is the Rambam Mevayru Mechadish. This is the Rambam explaining and comes up with the idea, the novel ideas. Kishem v'yivav zechiras Shabbos. Just like by mentioning Shabbos, is ikronit azoy der inyan shlili shaba. It's mainly not so much the idea that we negate in it, heder amlocha, not to do work, not the inyan chiyuv Shabbos menucha, but mainly the positive of chiyuv shaba, the positive of Shabbos, menucha, resting. Al derech zeh is der chiyuv sipur b'yitzias Mitzrayim. Nitazoy in der Shlila, the talk, the obligation to tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, not so much in the negative, which means that we are no longer slaves, the Yitzias B'nai Yisrael, from Avdus and Rishus Pare, that we left, the B'nai Yisrael left the slavery and the domain of Pare, nor be'iker in dem inyan chiyuve, but mainly in the positive, they werden B'nai Chodim, they become free people. That's the main part. But the Rambam is just madgish gleich in the zweiter halacha. This is an introduction to what the second halacha the Rambam says. As a filu in the sipur b'tzias Mitzrayim, in a even when we tell the story in the lowest and simplest way, you have to explain. Over there too, we have to tell about the miracles and everything. Why don't we just make it short for this simpleton, for this child who doesn't know the way the Rambam says? How do we tell it in the lowest and simplest way? Dahainu. When you relate the exodus of Egypt to a small child or a child who's a tipish, who's a fool, is b'shas as omer Eloi, when he says to him, B'ni, my son, kulono yinu avodim, we were all slaves, just as this maidservant, as this male servant, the Mitzrayim in Egypt. So then he concludes, not briefly, the Rambam, it would seem it would be fitting. When you're talking to a minor or a fool, why go into details? Where it says, no, the Rambam continues and says, he doesn't just say, on this day we left there. He doesn't say that. That Hashem redeemed us. And he took us out for freedom. Telling us that we are free. This articulates and it emphasizes that there is cherus over here. Was ist im Fall nicht nur die Yitzia Mitzias Mitzrayim Podo Isonu. It's not just that he took us out from there, nor as der Eibishter hat uns gemacht, when he made us free people. Und der Fun kommt da raus wie der Rambam is man. That's part of relating Yitzis Mitzrayim. And from this results, it comes out as the Rambam continues. As chayiv odom laharis es atzmi kihilu hu ba'asma yotza atam mishibud Mitzrayim. That a person needs to show himself as if he himself is now going out from the slavery of Egypt. In an oifen, in a way, as ki'ilu ato ba'atzmacha yiso eved, as if you yourself was a slave. And you went out to freedom. Again, there's the emphasis of freedom and redemption, not just you left there, but you went out to become cherus. You became free people. The Rambam concludes there. When you feast on this night, meal, on this night, you sit in a freedom way. The conduct of this night needs to be like a free person, in a way of freedom. So that aspect of Zechira, you mention, what do you mention? You mention not just that we're no longer slaves, but we are free, that the positive free people. And that's the comparison that the Rambam learns from Shabbos. Just like Shabbos, the main thing is menucha, not working. The same thing here is not just not being slaves, but being ben chayrin. And that's why even to a tepesh or a ben kotten, you tell him about the chayrus. And that's why we have to act out in the chayrus, because it's all about the emphasis about chayrus. Tes, v'yesh loymar, as euch das nimmt reis der Rambam von Loshen Medrash Hanal, for the Medrash. The Rambam also takes this from the Medrash, from Siyum Loshen HaMedrash, from the end of the language of the Medrash. Zochar es hayom hazeh sheyitzosem miMitzrayim, and he says Lomo, ki b'chayzik yod hayitziacha Hashem miMitzrayim. Hashem took you out with a strong hand. Das was man gedacht ankommen zu chayzik yod. The fact that we needed the strong hand. A special act, not just to take you out. He took you out with a strong hand. The nisim and iflois, those miracles and wonders, by Yitzis Mitzrayim, by the exit of Egypt, is b'chayzik yod, is nit azoy tzulib der shlila. That's not just to go out. We didn't need that chayzik yod. Not so much to remove your slavery, to take away the negative. That Arosh came for Shibut Mitzrayim, to go out from Shibut Mitzrayim. But the Gzeir is doch melachatchila given. To begin with, the decree was Vavod Nevino Isom Arba Meis Shana was just for 400 years. Gleich was it gegendig the Arba Meis Shana. And as soon as the 400 years completed, Hamidin B'derech Memele gedacht Arosh came for Shibut Mitzrayim. They automatically needed to go out of the slavery of Egypt. So we didn't need the B'chayzik Yod for that. They would have gone out of Egypt. What does the Medrash says? Pos bring B'chayzik Yod, Narchuli the Minyan Chiyuvim. But that is for the positive aspect of this exodus. To make them into free people. An ausgeteilte Volk, a distinguished nation, B'nei Chaydim. Kol's man misa Volk. Was das is la'olam, am olam. As long as we're a nation, which is for eternity, we're always going to be a nation, because we are an am olam, we're an eternal nation. We're free people. That is the b'chayzik yod that added to the. With the Rambam is das madgish in Hemshech HaPerek. The Rambam emphasized this in the continuation of this chapter. Those was tzorich l'sayim b'shvach. that the fact that you need to end with praise, that when you conclude the night of the Seder is those was Messiahim Bedasa Emes, is the fact that the conclude with our true religion, Shekarvona Mokim Loi, that the Eibishter has brought us close to him, Vivdilonim Umis, and he this separated us from all the nations. Bikervonu Lichude, he brought us close to his unity. The Chain Messiah, and this finally he concludes, Benisim v'nifloes shenasa lonu u'becherusenu, the miracles and the wonders that were done in our freedom. So we see in the Rambam that this is all about the chedus that was took place over there. So that's what the Rambam is out to tell us in the comparison to Shabbos, to tell us about the part of the chedus, which Bnei Chodim, which is a major part of our Zechirus Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that's why the pasuk also says B'chayzik Yod, to tell us that strength that made us into a Bnei Chodim for Am Olam. And now the Rebbe is going to say that this also fits in that when we learn it out from Shabbos is not just to teach us, but Shabbos actually is the reason for it. Not so we know it because Shabbos. This is the way by Shabbos, the same way is by Pesach, but Shabbos becomes the cause for Pesach. And as the Rebbe is going to explain it, B'Pnimis in Yonim, Yud. Shengeret Filmo, we spoke already many times. As B'Shas, we let him top in Inyan von Atzveiten. When we learn one thing from the other, Chochas L'Chayr is the limud blois araya for uns. Although the learning is only evident, we learn it because we want to know. We see by Shabbos, we say the same thing. It seems it's just a proof how we should celebrate, how we should remember Yitzias Mitzrayim. B'chdei mizol wissen dem Inyan, in order we should know this idea, darf man es upland for Tzveitni, you need to learn from this other idea. But there's a lot more to it. If we learn one thing from the other thing is actually the inspiration, the reason for this. Avol Pikein. Because of the wholesomeness of Torah. B'meila, Tachlis Hadik and Ali the Protim. It's totally precise in all the detail. Muzman onem, and we have to accept as bipnimis ha'inyonim. In the inner matter of things, is that inyan hamalamed, the idea which teaches us, nitnor koveya malamed, that oifund over animlot. It's not only that it sets and teaches us the way for what we're learning from it, that it is oich der tam, but it's also the reason or the siba, the cause for the inyan hanilmad, from the idea that is being learned atzvay. Or that al koponim for zayin hamshach on gilutzun, or minimally, that becomes the reason that it's extended and revealed to us. So the Rebbe is going to explain how the idea of Shabbos is the source and the reason for the Zechira of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Benitten the Dan zet mit us by from Goli, in our case, we see it in an open way. When we do Primius, when we look in the inner parts of Torah, as known, the Rambam, it's himself hid in his work also the Pnimis HaTorah. Kiyudua, as known as in Divrei Rambam B'Sforim, that in the words of Rambam in his Sforim, Zanedoin Yonim for Pnimis HaTorah, there are aspects of the inner part of Torah. So Zanen aber dort nit begoliv, they're not openly, nor behalt der Hetu der Achremes, they're hidden in a hinted way. Says Mavur in Chassidus, explained in Chassidus as the Tzvei Yonim Anal in Shabbos, the two above aspects of Shabbos, the Shvisa from Malacha, resting from work, and that he rested from work, and the Shvisa Menucha Chiyuvis, and the resting and the positive relaxed. By Yonach B'Yem HaShvi, Zayin Tzvei Madreges in Shabbos, there are two levels in Shabbos. There's Shabbos the Laila, there's the night of Shabbos, Ubesudas Shabbos and the Harishayna and the first meal. On Shabbos the Yoima, and Shabbos of the daytime, Suda Shni in the second day. Klolus Inyan von Shabbos is v'karosel l'Shabbos enik. Generally, Shabbos idea, Shabbos is supposed to be called, you're supposed to make it a delight, make it an oinek. The inyan ha'oinek, the idea of delight, und in dem inyan, und dem tainug, seine dort zwei madreges. In this delight of Shabbos, there's two levels, two steps. Der tainug from them was at his shevis memalachta, the delight from the fact that he's resting from not doing work. The hainu. Vidos is bedugma by the modem lamata, which is similar by the person below. Seine koiches, that his strength, his powers, which extend and become restricted in the work and in doing and work, they go back to the source in the soul. They've been extended out into the Asiya, and they go back to the source. Und von dem hat Tainug, and then he has a delight from it. Aber der Tainug, but that delight is noch verbunden mit Malacha, it's still associated with work. Kommt zu sich von seiner Ravanya, he comes to himself from his efforts, from his hard work. Und euch Tainug Proti, this is also a very specific delight, verbunden mit der Schwiss von der Asiya Protis, that's associated to resting from that particular thing that he was doing. So it's a rest from what he was doing. But on a higher level, the Mailam is that Tainug was verbunden mit Menucha be'etzem. Higher is the delight which is associated with relaxing in essence. Was kommt noch der Tainug mishvis melucha, that follows, that comes after. First you delight not working. And then you have a delight that you're in essence delight. Was demult vert nisgala etzem atainug, then is revealed the essence of the delight. Was is hecher von hoben hashayches. That is higher, that delight, from having a connection, from having any connection with the prota asiyah from the malacha, with the specific actions of this work, or malacha b'chlal, work in general. But those zayin and the tzvei madreges, the two madreges, it says zocher v'shomer in the Sersa Dibres. It says once zocher and then it says shomer. What shomer is lenukva. Shomer is feminine, but those is shaykh to Shabbos the Lailo. That's connected to Shabbos of the nighttime. It's a connection to the world. It's b'chlolus, b'lekus, and generally when we talk about in godliness, it does the madrege from Eira Memalakulam. That's the step, the level that fills the world. That has a connection to the world. Was b'sheishis imeachol werd der Eir nimshach v'nisamtzem kavyochel in Welt. During the 6 weekdays, that light extends and retracts in the world, and on Shabbos it goes up. So there is a Shabbos lenukva, the night of Shabbos. Belayla the Shabbato by the Shvisa Melocha, the night of Shabbos when you rest from of work, is Botlu Halavush. So then the garment is negated, the Asiya, as is made of Gilui. It's openly shines. So the weekday, the Eira Mamali comes in a garment restricted and blocked, and tzimtzum in the world, and on Shabbos it's open. Zocher leduchra, the second madrega zocher is for the masculine, the madrega from Yom Shabbat. That's the day of Shabbos. The gilu from Eira Seivu Kol Almin. That's the revelation of the light that surrounds the world. Was his hecher from his chalkus and his slapshus in the Rasiv Umlocha. That is higher, and it doesn't divide itself and doesn't dress up in doing a malacha. It's menucha be'etzem. It's in essence menucha. It's seviv kulam. And the Rebbe gefindt man, that's what you find, as from alle yomim tovim, that from all other yomim tovim werden befedish nor Pesach angerufen Shabbos. Only Pesach is called Shabbos. Mochras HaShabbos means Pesach. Because those miracles and wonders which were totally beyond nature, by the Geula from Mitzrayim, by the redemption of Egypt, seine verbunden mit der Hecherer Madrege von Shabbos. They're associated with the higher level of Shabbos. in Pesach. And das is mevuar the Rambam, and this is explained in the Rambam as the lisaper benisim v'niflois, that relate the miracles and the wonders shenasal aviseinu b'mitzrayim that were done to our father in Egypt. Shenemer zocher asayim hazeh. Remember the day is Kimosh Nemer zocher asayim Shabbos. We get it from the Yom Shabbos. Behainu, the means as the inyan chiyuvi from the saper benisim v'niflois the Yitzis Mitzrayim. This positive aspect to relate the miracles and the wonders of Yitzis Mitzrayim, nemtzach from Zocher Yom HaShabbos. This comes from remembering the day of Shabbos, that higher level of Shabbos, from the inyan chiyuvi from Shabbos u'menucha mitzad atzma, from the positive idea of Shabbos u'menucha b'tzad atzma, the level of Seviv Kol. Was sein dik ha-madrege, was is legamri hecher from Welt, because it's a level which is totally higher than world. So then when it does come to the world, is funesu pella, in a miracle and a wonder. Nisim hamulaboshim b'teva, in teva, not dressed up in teva. This is the miracle, the idea of the Shabbos, the Zocharas Yom Shabbos, the Menucha, the level of Seviv Kol. Tzadem Gufa is geworden the Shleimus Achedus von Eden. And that alone brought about the wholesome, the freedom of Yidden and Eufen, that their Chedus, as from them on from then on, they can never be slaves. But the Geula nemtzach from Bechinas Shabbos, the Geula comes from Shabbos. Alma the Chedu, the world of freedom. But Saddam's and Eden Eivge geworden, and because of this, the Yidden were raised from the Mitzarim or Gevulim from Seder Ishtalshlus, from the limitations, the boundaries of the Seder Ishtalshlus. So this is how, from Shabbos, it comes to the higher level of Yetzias Mitzrayim, to the Nisim B'Niflos, to the level of Chedus, to the level of freedom. The real freedom, eternal freedom. Shleimus B'Zeh Zayin, the wholesomeness would be Begula Hasidah B'Korev Mamish, and the coming redemption very soon was as Zayin, Achedus Gula Mitzvah. It'll be a freedom and a true redemption, or Shleimus B'Goli, and openly, complete, wholesome. Also miracles and wonders openly. As the days, also love it, as the Mashiach comes, the days that you left Egypt, I will show you niflois. Especially in the day which is the day of Lost Love, which is a Shabbos Menucha for eternity. This is Mesichas Achron Shel Pesach Tov Shin Mem.